She bullied black men for years, hiding behind her badge, until the one she took to court caused her entire world to shatter and collapse. The late afternoon sun painted the streets of Brookhaven in golden hues, casting long shadows over familiar sidewalks. Roger tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he turned down Maple Avenue, just 2 blocks from his childhood home. After years of city life in Seattle, these streets still felt like home, quiet, unassuming, and filled with memories of simpler times. He had come back for a weekend visit, nothing more. Just a few days to check in on his mother, share some laughter, and escape the relentless pace of his corporate life. On the passenger seat, a brown paper bag sat neatly, holding a few groceries, milk, a loaf of bread, and lemon cookies, her favorite. Roger smiled softly at the thought of her joy when he walked through the door with those small comforts. But the peace of that moment began to fray. In the rearview mirror, flashing red and blue lights caught his eye. A patrol car, trailing him for several blocks now, suddenly came alive with urgency. Roger's heart sank slightly, a familiar tension tightening his chest. He signaled, pulled over calmly, and exhaled slowly. "Just a routine stop," he muttered to himself. "Stay calm." The patrol car door swung open with practiced authority. Officer Nayla emerged, her posture rigid, mirrored sunglasses hiding her eyes but not the weight of her presence. One hand hovered near her holster as she approached. "License and registration," she demanded flatly. Roger kept his hands on the wheel. "Sure, I'm just going to reach into my glove compartment," he replied, his voice steady, though inside he felt the stirrings of frustration. "Nice and slow," she snapped. He complied, handing over the documents. "What brings you here?" she asked, eyeing the rental sticker on his windshield. "My mother lives just over there." Roger nodded toward the side street. "I flew in from Seattle." Nayla paused, then stepped back. "Step out of the vehicle." Roger blinked, unsure he heard correctly. "I'm sorry?" "Out, now." There was no room for reason, no explanation, only the cold exercise of power. As he stepped out, hands visible, a wave of disbelief washed over him. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, on the side of the road in his own neighborhood, being treated like a suspect. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," she said curtly, circling him like prey. Roger felt the familiar weight of disappointment, not fear. He had hoped for a peaceful return, but instead he stood in the center of an all-too-familiar scene, profiled, judged, and reduced to a threat. And in that moment, something shifted. He wasn't going to walk away quietly this time. Roger stood silently by the side of the road, the sun now dipping lower, casting long shadows over the pavement. The breeze that had felt so gentle just moments ago now seemed sharp, carrying with it a sting of something old, something unwelcome. He watched Officer Nayla as she circled him, her steps deliberate, as if each movement was calculated to remind him who held the authority here. "Turn around, place your hands on the hood," she ordered, voice clipped and impersonal. For a brief second, Roger hesitated, not in defiance, but in disbelief. He looked into her eyes, or rather into the reflection of himself in her mirrored sunglasses, and saw the same tired face he'd seen so many times before in others, who had been stopped for reasons that no one ever truly explained. A man judged not by his actions, but by how he looked standing behind the wheel of a car. "Is that really necessary?" he asked quietly, keeping his voice even, respectful. Her response was a sharp step forward, her hand brushing her holster. "Hands on the hood, now." The cool metal of the car met his palms as he complied, the heat of the day still radiating off its surface. As she began her rough search, Roger kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, forcing his breathing to remain steady. Humiliation, slow and methodical, settled over him like a heavy coat. "I'm a consultant," he said, more to the sky than to her. "I work with Fortune 500 companies. I don't carry weapons. I don't carry drugs. You won't find anything." "Don't speak," she snapped. "You're only making this worse for yourself." Her words cut deeper than the tight grip she had on his wrists as she cuffed him. Not because they were new, but because they were familiar. Words meant to silence, to control. A second patrol car pulled up behind them. Officer Hernandez stepped out, younger, less certain. He approached slowly, glancing at Nayla, then at Roger, his brow furrowed. "Backup requested," Nayla said, her tone professional, almost mechanical. Hernandez nodded, but Roger saw it, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "What's the charge?" Roger asked as calmly as he could manage. "Resisting arrest," Nayla replied, tightening the cuffs. "You raised your voice. You stepped toward me." Roger turned his head slightly. "No," he said. "I asked you a question. That's all." But it didn't matter. The narrative had been set. And in that moment, truth bent beneath the weight of authority. As they drove toward the station, Roger sat in the back of the patrol car, hands bound, phone buzzing in his pocket. His mother, no doubt, wondering where he was. The groceries sat abandoned on the passenger seat, milk warming under the fading sun. His thoughts drifted, not to fear, but to exhaustion. He was tired of being the one who always had to explain, to justify, to prove his innocence. At the station, the cold fluorescent lights flickered above as he was processed, his mugshot taken, fingerprints recorded, clipboard shoved at him without explanation. Nayla stood nearby, filling out the report with practiced ease. Her pen moved quickly, almost effortlessly, as she wrote the same phrases she had likely written dozens of times before. Aggressive, non-compliant, threatening. But something about Roger unnerved her. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't begged. He hadn't even raised his voice. He had simply looked at her with disappointment, not fear, and it lingered. They placed him on a hard bench, left him there with nothing but the hum of the lights and the occasional distant murmur from behind the desk. He leaned back, closed his eyes. This wasn't new, but this time he wouldn't let it go. The hours dragged, no phone call, no explanation, just silence. But Roger was used to thinking through problems under pressure. Back in his office, he had helped companies navigate crises, make strategic decisions with little margin for error. Now he applied that same focus to his own situation. When the door finally opened, the officer who stepped in was older, graying at the temples, clipboard in hand. "You're being charged with obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. Bail hearing set for this afternoon." Roger looked up. "I didn't resist. I didn't obstruct. I was pulled over for no reason." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "It's in the report." "I want to see it." "You'll need your lawyer for that." Roger nodded. "Then I'll call one." They handed him a phone. One call. He dialed Nathan. Nathan, a former law school friend, turned criminal defense attorney, picked up on the third ring. "Roger, what's going on?" "I need help," Roger said simply. 30 minutes later, Nathan was on his way. By the time Nathan arrived, sharp in a navy suit, calm but commanding, Nayla felt the first real stirrings of uncertainty. She didn't like his presence, didn't like the way he carried himself, as if he already knew what she had done. "I'm representing Mr. Roger," Nathan said, "and I'd like to review the arrest footage and incident report." That's internal, she replied, her fingers tapping the desk. If you're confident in your report, officer, you wouldn't mind. She didn't answer. Roger was released on bail 2 hours later. As he walked out side by side with Nathan, Nayla watched from behind her desk, and something twisted inside her, a tightness, a shadow of something she hadn't felt in years. Doubt. The sky over Brookhaven was heavy with clouds the next morning, but Roger's mind was clearer than it had been in hours. He sat across from Nathan at a small table inside the lawyer's office, a steaming cup of coffee untouched before him. His wrists still bore faint marks from the cuffs, a subtle reminder that this wasn't just a bad dream. It had happened. Again. But this time, it wasn't going to fade into silence. Nathan shuffled through a thick stack of papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. This isn't her first time, he said, tapping a document. 2 formal complaints, both filed by black men, one sealed, one dismissed without review. Roger leaned forward, the weight of those words settling in his chest. She's done this before. Yes, Nathan nodded, but no one pushed it. They didn't have the means, or maybe they just wanted to move on. Roger exhaled slowly. He wasn't surprised, but he was angry, not in a way that burned hot, but in the way that simmered, steady and unrelenting. We need more, he said, more than just my word against hers. Nathan's eyes sharpened. We'll get it. The next days moved with a deliberate pace. Nathan filed motions for access to Nayla's dashcam footage, subpoenaed her previous arrest records, and began reaching out quietly to those who might know more. Roger, too, worked methodically. Every evening he sat at the desk in his mother's small living room, combing through public records, news clippings, and any trace of Nayla's past encounters. He wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking for patterns and proof. It was during one of those late nights that a name caught his eye. Jacob Alvarez, court clerk, listed on one of the old dismissed complaints. Something about it lingered in Roger's mind. The next day, Nathan arranged a discreet meeting. Jacob sat nervously at a corner booth in a quiet cafe downtown, fingers tapping against a chipped coffee mug. He looked up as Nathan and Roger approached, his eyes cautious but not closed. I remember you, Jacob said softly, looking at Roger. I saw your name on the docket. I didn't think you'd fight it. Roger gave a small nod. I wasn't planning to, at first, but this can't keep happening. Jacob glanced around, then leaned in. I've seen things. Files that were mishandled. Complaints that got buried. Officer Nayla, she's been protected for a long time. Roger felt a slow rise in his chest, a mix of hope and frustration. Can you help us? Jacob hesitated, then nodded. I kept copies. Not everything, but enough. I'll testify if it comes to that. Nathan placed a steady hand on the table. It will. That evening, back at the office, they laid everything out, the sealed complaint, Jacob's documents, names, dates. The picture was becoming clear. Nayla wasn't just a rogue officer. She was part of a system that looked the other way. Roger sat back, hands clasped together, staring at the evidence. People like her count on us being quiet. Nathan nodded. But you're not. No, Roger said. Not this time. Meanwhile, across town, Nayla sat at her kitchen table, the court notice folded neatly beside her. Her eyes lingered on it, the words blurring at the edges. A motion to suppress, a request for dash cam footage, a formal complaint. For years, she had written the same reports, followed the same protocols, at least in her mind, and no one had questioned her until now. Doubt, that unfamiliar weight, pressed against her ribs. She opened her laptop, clicked on the dash cam folder, and watched herself, calm but cold, as she ordered Roger out of the car, as she shoved him, as he stood there, compliant, not resisting. Her jaw tightened. It didn't look like power anymore. It looked like fear. Hers. 2 days later, Nathan received the court's approval. The dash cam footage would be admitted. Roger sat quietly as Nathan explained, his eyes steady, but his heart beating faster. "This is it," Nathan said. "Once that footage plays, everything changes." Roger nodded, though his mind wasn't on the footage. It was on what came next. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about every man before him and everyone who might come after. Word spread quickly. Small towns don't keep secrets for long. At the barber shop, at church, on front porches and street corners, people started talking. Some defended Nayla, saying she was just doing her job. Others, like Wallace, a retired factory worker, stepped forward. "She did the same to me," Wallace said, standing in Nathan's office, hands trembling slightly. "I never told anyone. Figured it wouldn't matter." "It matters now," Roger replied. By the end of the week, they had 3 more sworn statements, 3 more stories that echoed Roger's own. And Nayla? She felt the world closing in. At the precinct, the air had changed. Conversations paused when she entered the room. Eyes that once looked at her with respect now looked through her, or worse, with pity. She sat alone in her car that night, staring at the courthouse steps, wondering when everything had shifted, wondering if, somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing people and started seeing threats. For Roger, the shift was different. It was a growing sense of purpose, a belief that truth, once unearthed, couldn't be buried again. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about breaking the silence. And they were just getting started. The courtroom was smaller than Roger expected, but it felt immense. The walls, a dull beige, seemed to pulse with the quiet tension of those gathered. Rows of wooden benches filled with faces, some familiar, some curious, all watching. They weren't just here for the hearing. They were here for something deeper, for a truth that had long been hidden beneath uniforms and reports. Roger sat at the defense table, his hands folded, a calm mask over a racing heart. Beside him, Nathan shuffled through a thick folder of documents. Across the room, Nayla sat in uniform, her face set, but her shoulders slightly hunched as if the weight of the badge on her chest had become too much to bear. Judge Harris entered, his presence commanding but not overbearing. The gavel's bang echoed, sharp and final. "All rise." As everyone sat, Roger's eyes didn't leave Nayla. He saw not just the officer who had humiliated him, but the symbol of a system that needed this moment, this reckoning. Nathan stood first, voice steady. "Your Honor, the defense moved to present key evidence, the dash cam footage from Officer Nayla's cruiser on the day in question. This footage directly contradicts the incident report filed against my client." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The lights dimmed slightly, the screen flickered on, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Roger watched himself on the screen, reliving it, the stop, the commands, the shove. His voice calm, respectful. Nayla's tone sharp, escalating without cause. There it was, clear and undeniable. He never resisted. When the footage ended, the silence was thick. Judge Harris turned to Nayla. "Officer Nayla, is this the interaction as you described in your report?" Nayla shifted, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Not exactly, Your Honor. But in the moment, did the defendant at any point raise his voice or make sudden movements toward you?" She looked at Roger for the first time, truly seeing him, not as a suspect, but as a man she had tried to break. "No," she admitted, her voice low. "He didn't." A murmur rippled through the room, like a wave washing over old doubts, eroding them. Nathan rose again. "Your Honor, we have 3 sworn statements from other individuals within this community who experienced similar encounters with Officer Naila. These are not isolated events. They form a pattern." He called Wallace first, a retired man with weathered hands and steady eyes. Wallace spoke quietly, recounting his own stop, his own humiliation. Then came a school teacher, then a warehouse worker. Each story a mirror of Roger's, and each time Naila stared ahead, eyes unfocused, her world unraveling one word at a time. Finally, it was her turn. She walked to the stand, the courtroom heavy with expectation. Sworn in, she sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Nathan approached, slow and deliberate. "How long have you served with the Brookhaven Police Department?" 12 years, she answered. "In those years, how many formal complaints have been filed against you?" 4. "Do you believe any were valid?" She hesitated. "No." "Even this one?" Silence. "Officer Naila," Nathan pressed, his voice softening, "do you now believe you were wrong?" Her eyes flickered to the judge, then to the back of the courtroom where Jacob sat watching. Finally, she looked at Roger. "Yes," she whispered. The judge called for a recess. Outside, the air was thick, humid. Reporters clustered at the steps, cameras flashing. Roger didn't speak to them. He didn't need to. The footage had spoken. The testimony had spoken. And for the first time, truth wasn't being drowned out. Inside, when court resumed, Judge Harris reviewed the evidence aloud, every word a nail sealing the old narrative shut. "There is sufficient evidence to proceed with a full trial against Officer Naila for misconduct and falsifying a police report. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell. Naila stood slowly, the badge on her chest no longer a shield, but a mark of something lost. She walked out, not defiant, but hollow. For Roger, it wasn't about victory. It was about clarity, about knowing that silence had not won this time. Nathan placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it." Roger shook his head. "We're not done." The days that followed moved quickly. The footage spread first local, then beyond. Naila's name became a symbol, not just of personal failure, but of a deeper rot. She was suspended without pay. Her face was everywhere, but her voice was absent. The community shifted. Conversations changed. People who had once whispered now spoke openly. At church, in shops, on porches, the silence had cracked. A week later, at a town hall, Jacob stepped forward. His voice shook, but it carried. No one should fear being asked why they're walking home. No one should have to prove they deserve respect. We can't change the past, but we can stop repeating it. The applause was small but real, and Roger, standing at the back, knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them, about a town learning, slowly, painfully, how to see. The sun hung low over Brookhaven as the town slowly absorbed the weight of what had happened. For some, it was just another case, something that made the news, stirred opinions, and would eventually fade. But for others, everything felt different now. The silence that once cloaked these streets had been peeled back, and what lay beneath was raw, exposed. Naila sat at the edge of her bed, her uniform folded neatly beside her. The suspension notice from the department lay untouched on the nightstand. Her hands were still resting on her knees, but her mind was loud. Too loud. Her phone vibrated again, another missed call from the union attorney. They had promised to fight for her, to argue context, stress, to paint the picture of a good officer caught in a difficult moment. But deep down, she knew there was no saving this. The footage didn't lie, and the eyes of the town had shifted from respect to avoidance, to something colder. She used to walk into the precinct and feel power settle on her shoulders like armor. Now it was like weight, pressing her down. Meanwhile, Roger was back at his mother's house, sitting on the porch where he'd spent countless afternoons as a child. The air was thick with humidity, but he didn't mind. For the first time in weeks, he felt stillness, but not the kind that comes with complacency. This was the kind that comes after you've pushed a boulder up a hill and can finally take a breath, not because the work is done, but because you know you've begun something that matters. His phone buzzed with messages, friends, strangers, people sharing their own stories of stops, searches, moments where they too were made to feel small. He read them all, not for validation, but as a reminder that this wasn't just about him. Nathan had called earlier that day. The trial will move forward, he had said, but they're offering her a deal, no jail time, if she surrenders her badge and agrees never to work in law enforcement again. Roger didn't respond right away. He stared out at the street, at the kids riding bikes, at the neighbors mowing their lawns like any other day. Let her go, he finally said. This was never about locking her up. It's about making sure she can't do it again. Across town, the deal was made. Nyla handed in her badge, her gun, and walked out of the precinct not as an officer, but as a woman without a shield. The media didn't follow her anymore. The town didn't whisper as loudly, but they didn't forget. Her house went up for sale quietly. She packed her things alone, the rooms echoing with a life she couldn't reclaim. Every time she passed a mirror, she saw not the uniform, but the choices that had led her here. She thought of the dash cam footage, of Roger's face, of her own reflection in his eyes, that moment when control slipped away, and all that was left was fear. She applied for work in private security, but word followed her. Her name wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to the headlines, to the courtroom, to the story that had been told and retold. What she once wore with pride now closed every door. But the town, it began to shift. At Eastside Community Center, Roger started something small, a weekly workshop, just a handful of people at first. Know your rights, he called it, not just about traffic stops or legal jargon, but about voice, about standing firm even when it felt easier to stay quiet. Teenagers, single parents, seniors. They came curious at first, then committed. Some brought their own stories, some just listened. And one evening in the back of the room, a young officer in plain clothes sat quietly, notebook in hand. Roger noticed him but didn't call him out. Presence was enough. Nathan visited often, helping Roger file a civil suit, not for money but for public record access. They wanted the town to see the pattern, to understand that this wasn't about one bad officer, but about a culture that allowed silence to thrive. At the barber shop, conversations deepened. At schools, teachers added the case to their curriculum. At churches, prayers for justice turned into calls for action. One night after a session, a teenager named Malik approached Roger. "Did you ever think about quitting?" he asked. Roger smiled, a little tired but full. "More times than I can count. So why didn't you?" Roger looked around the room at the people still lingering, still talking. "Because if I did," he said, "she'd still have her badge. and we'd still think staying quiet was the only way to survive. Nyla, 2 towns over, sat alone one evening, scrolling through a video online. It was Roger speaking softly to a group, his voice calm but unwavering. "Your silence," he said, "is someone else's permission." She closed the laptop and stared into the dark. Not everyone gets redemption, but the lesson didn't belong to her anymore. Brookhaven wasn't the kind of town that liked attention. Nestled between fields and rivers, it moved at its own pace, slow, steady, predictable. But since the trial, something had shifted. The familiar rhythm hadn't returned. Conversations that used to stop when uncomfortable truth surfaced now lingered, stretching into the spaces that silence once filled. Roger noticed it everywhere. At the grocery store, people nodded, not just in greeting, but in recognition. At the cafe, strangers approached, not with pity, but with quiet respect. Not because he had won, but because he had spoken, and more importantly, because he had refused to back down. He still walked the same streets, still sat on the same porch, but now eyes met his a little differently. Not every glance was friendly, of course. Some were cautious, some resentful, but even those were honest in a way they hadn't been before. The illusion of unity, the false comfort of pretending things were fine, had been broken. On Tuesday nights, the community center lights stayed on later than usual. Roger's workshops, once a room of 5 or 6, had grown. Word spread from house to house, from one wary parent to another, until the small hall filled with voices, curious, tentative, eager. They came with questions. What do I do if I get stopped? Do I have to let them search me? How do I file a complaint, and will anyone listen? Roger didn't have all the answers, but he had something better experience. He spoke not as an expert above them, but as someone who had been in their shoes, someone who had felt the cold metal of cuffs for no reason, someone who knew what it meant to stand alone until others decided to stand with you. One night, an older woman raised her hand. "Do you think it'll really change anything?" she asked, her voice soft, tired. Roger paused, looking around the room. "It already has," he said, "because we're talking about it, because we're not pretending anymore." Nathan joined when he could, offering legal guidance, helping with forms, making sure no one left the room without knowing they mattered. He saw something growing, not just in Roger, but in the town, a slow, deliberate awakening. The civil suit Roger filed began to gain traction. Public records, once tucked away, were being reviewed. Complaints that had gathered dust were now on desks, being read, being questioned. The mayor released a statement, promising transparency, but Roger had learned not to trust words alone. He wanted proof, and so did the town. At Eastside High, Ms. Givens, a government teacher, added the case to her curriculum. "This," she told her students, "isn't just history, this is now, and you are part of it." They discussed rights, power, and the quiet ways systems protect themselves. They watched clips of the trial, debated what justice meant, and for some it was the first time they realized that knowing the law wasn't just for lawyers. In the barber shop, younger men who used to stay quiet now leaned in when the old head spoke. "She stood up because he did," Wallace said one Saturday, nodding toward Roger's name in the paper. "You mean Jacob?" someone asked. "No," Wallace smiled. "I mean both." Even the church bulletin had changed. Between announcements of bake sales and choir practice, a new line appeared. "There's power in your voice, even if it trembles." But not everyone welcomed the shift. There were whispers about Roger pushing too hard, about stirring things up. Some said it wasn't his place to keep the town in the spotlight, but Roger didn't push back. He just kept showing up across town. Jacob felt it too. His decision to come forward had cost him some friendships, strained family dinners. But when he walked into the community center and saw the room full, he knew it was worth it. He wasn't hiding anymore. One evening after a session, he approached Roger. "I used to think staying quiet was safer," Jacob admitted. "Easier." Roger nodded. "Me too." Jacob looked around the room, at the people talking, learning, growing. "But this feels better." For Nyla, the shift was more isolating. Her name still came up, though less often now. When she passed through town, people looked away, or didn't look at all. She had left the house she'd lived in for years, moved 2 towns over. But even there, the past followed. She had become a lesson, and while others moved on, she stayed behind, caught in the echo of her choices. But Roger wasn't looking for her anymore. He was looking ahead. The civil case brought more people forward, some from Brookhaven, some from places nearby. Men, women, even a former officer who had seen too much, said too little. Each story added weight to the truth Roger had carried alone for too long. And through it all, he stayed steady, not as a leader above them, but as a part of them. A man who had refused to accept silence as the only option. One night as the community center emptied, a teenage boy named Keon lingered. "You think I could help with the next session?" he asked. Roger smiled. "Of course." "You ever think about running for office?" Keon added, half joking. Roger laughed. "Let's take it one step at a time." But as Keon left, Roger stood for a moment, alone in the quiet. Maybe it wasn't just about what had happened. Maybe it was about what came next. The air was crisp that morning, the kind of cool that hinted at change. Roger sat alone in the community center, long after the last of the Tuesday night workshops had ended. The chairs were still scattered, the whiteboard half erased, faint outlines of words like rights, voice, and truth lingering in the space. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the silence, not with weariness, but with a sense of something new unfolding. It had been months since the courtroom had fallen silent, since Nyla's badge was taken, since the town had first begun to reckon with the truths they'd long buried. But for Roger, this journey was never just about her. It was about them, the community, the people who had walked past injustice for too long, and now were learning how to stop. He never imagined himself here. When he first stepped into that rental car, driving toward his mother's house with a bag of groceries, he had only wanted peace, a quiet weekend. But life had a way of calling people into roles they never asked for, and Roger had answered. Nathan called that afternoon, the civil case now closed. The town had agreed to release a full audit of past complaints, a public database of traffic stops, and a commitment to ongoing reform. "You did more than win," Nathan said. "You changed the way they see things." Roger smiled faintly. "It's not about how they see me. It's about how we see ourselves." He thought about Keon, about Jacob, about Wallace and every voice that had once trembled, but now stood steady. They were the reason he stayed, the reason he hadn't gone back to Seattle. There was more work to do. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Keon peeked in, a notebook in hand. "Got a minute?" Roger nodded, motioning him in. "I've been thinking," Keon began, "about doing more. Maybe starting something at school. A club, maybe. Like this, but for people my age." Roger's eyes lit up. "That's how it starts," he said. "One voice, then another." Keon grinned. You'll help me? Always. As Keon left, the door closing softly behind him, Roger stood, walking to the whiteboard. He wiped it clean, the surface gleaming in the light. A blank space, ready for what came next, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was carrying the weight alone. This wasn't just the end of a fight, it was the beginning of something greater. In a world where silence often protects injustice, this story reminds us that every voice has power. We live in a time when it's easy to turn away, to believe that one person can't make a difference, or that systems are too big to change. But change begins the moment we refuse to accept the unacceptable. Roger's journey shows us that courage isn't about grand gestures. It's about standing firm when it's easier to stay quiet. Discrimination, abuse of power, and false narratives still exist around us, sometimes in subtle forms, hidden behind titles, uniforms, or traditions. But when truth is spoken clearly, consistently, and with integrity, it can shift not only minds but entire communities. You don't have to be a lawyer, a leader, or a public figure to demand respect and fairness. You only need to know your worth, speak your truth, and believe that even a trembling voice can echo loudly in the hearts of others. Today, remember, justice begins with awareness, but it grows through action. Stand up not just for yourself, but for those who haven't yet found the strength. Your voice might be the one that breaks the silence.